He had three choices: walk away, pull the trigger, or break the one rule that had kept him sane for 5 years: never let anyone close enough to matter. The sun had already begun its slow surrender to the horizon when Elijah Mackenzie first noticed the shapes in the distance. He almost missed them. 5 years of talking to nobody but desert wind and the occasional passing hawk had made his eyes lazy, trained them to slide right over anything that wasn't firewood or water or something that might kill him in his sleep. But something made him look twice at those two dark smudges against the red sand, and when he did, he understood immediately what they were. Not rocks. Not scrub brush. People. 2 of them, and neither one was moving right. He stood at the edge of his camp, one hand resting on the side of his chuck wagon, the other hanging loose near the rifle he kept mounted within reach at all times. The chuck wagon was his kingdom and his prison both. A battered wooden vessel loaded with cast iron and flour sacks and 5 years' worth of accumulated solitude. He'd driven it maybe 300 miles total since the day trail boss Thompson had pressed the reins into his hands and said, "Take all the time you need, Elijah," and meant it kindly, even though kindness from other men had been hard to receive in those first black months after everything ended. The women collapsed within 30 feet of his fire. He could smell the beans he'd been cooking since noon, and he supposed they could too. Close enough for the scent to reach them. Not close enough to touch. He walked out to them slowly, not rushing, because rushing startled people and startled people made mistakes, and he'd seen enough mistakes for one lifetime. The younger one was on her side, her breathing shallow and wrong in the way breathing got when a body was deciding whether to keep bothering. The older one had managed to stay upright, barely, propped on one elbow with her eyes open and locked on Elijah as he approached. Those eyes didn't plead. Didn't beg. Didn't show fear in any way he could read easily. They just watched him with the particular stillness of someone who had calculated the odds and arrived at a number they'd already made peace with. She was Apache, both of them were, and she'd had enough experience with white men and guns to know that what happened in the next few seconds was entirely out of her hands. Elijah's hand moved toward his rifle and he watched her watch him do it. She didn't flinch. Didn't make a sound. Just kept her eyes on his face, patient and resigned and utterly without the kind of fear that begs for mercy. Because begging for mercy required believing mercy was a possibility, and she'd apparently stopped believing that some time ago. He had 3 choices and he knew them all clearly. He could walk away. The desert was efficient about these things and would finish the job without any help from him. He could end it fast, the way you ended suffering in cattle that broke a leg on rocky ground, and tell himself he'd been kind about it. Or he could break the rule he'd been following for 5 years, the most important rule, the one he'd built his entire existence around since the day he'd had to dig 2 graves in the rocky Texas soil. Never let anyone close enough to matter. His hand dropped from the rifle. The younger woman made a sound then. It wasn't a word and it wasn't quite a moan. It was something older than either of those things, something that lived below language in the part of the body that speaks when the mind is too far gone to manage. Elijah had heard that sound once before. He had been holding his 7-year-old daughter Beth in his arms when it came out of her, that same soft involuntary surrender, and he had felt the exact moment her small body stopped fighting and started letting go. And he had been completely, utterly, devastatingly powerless to stop any of it. He crossed the remaining distance in 3 strides. "How long since you ate?" His voice came out rough and strange. He didn't use it much anymore. Mostly he talked to the sourdough starter he kept in a ceramic crock near the fire, murmuring to it the way you talk to something you were responsible for keeping alive. He talked to the desert sometimes, and occasionally to his wife and daughter, knowing they weren't there to hear him but unable to fully stop. The older woman's lips moved. No sound. She tried again, forcing the words out through cracked lips and a throat that had forgotten moisture. 4 days. Maybe 5. The younger one's eyes rolled back. Elijah stopped thinking and started moving, because that was the only thing that worked in moments like these. Cookie didn't freeze. Cookie assessed and acted, because people were depending on him and hesitation was how you lost people. He bent down and lifted the younger woman from the ground. She weighed almost nothing. Bones and deerskin and a fever that radiated through his shirt the moment he gathered her up, a heat so intense it felt like holding something recently pulled from coals. The older one tried to stand on her own. Made it halfway and crumpled. Elijah caught her with his free arm, steadying her against his side, and she leaned into him with the full desperate weight of someone who had burned through every last reserve of pride somewhere back along the trail. 10 feet, he said. That's all I need from you. 10 feet to the fire and I can help you. But you have to make it 10 feet. She made it 8 before her legs quit entirely. He half carried, half dragged both of them to the edge of his camp and settled them against the water barrel, just outside the ring of stones that marked what he thought of as Cookie's domain. The boundary where the rules applied and order still held. He'd kept that boundary for 5 years. Kept every rule with the devotion of a man who believed, somewhere beneath the rational part of his mind, that perfect adherence to procedure might somehow balance some cosmic ledger. Might make the universe notice that he was doing everything right now. Might give him back, in some form he couldn't quite articulate, the wife and daughter he'd lost because he'd been 50 yards away gathering firewood when everything went wrong. Don't move, he told them. I'll bring food to you. The older woman caught his wrist as he turned. Her grip was weak but her eyes were not. No money, she said. The words came with an edge of old humiliation, the practiced preemptive defense of someone who had learned to name the transaction before the other person could use it against her. Didn't ask for any? Her eyes narrowed slightly. Why? Because I'm Cookie, he said, and Cookie feeds people who need feeding. That's the rule. He pulled gently free of her grip and returned to his fire. The beans had been simmering since before noon, the way he always made them, slow and patient, cooked for no one in particular because there was no one. There hadn't been anyone for 5 years except the 4 tin plates he set out every single meal without fail, a ritual so ingrained he'd stopped thinking about it the way you stop thinking about breathing. 4 plates. 1 for him. 1 for Noah. 1 for Beth. 1 for the space where whoever else might have joined their family could have sat. The stubborn irrational insistence on 4 plates was possibly the most honest thing about Elijah Mackenzie, because it admitted plainly what he would never have said aloud, that he was still waiting, still setting the table for people who were gone, still refusing to fully believe the world could really be arranged the way it apparently was. He didn't serve them from the main pot. He ladled from the smaller pot he kept at the edge of the coals, where things cooked longer and softer. Added water to thin the beans into broth because stomachs that had forgotten food needed to be reintroduced gently. Crumbled cornbread into the liquid until it dissolved into something that was more medicine than meal. 2 tin cups of water, carefully measured. Not too much. Too much and their bodies would reject it, and they'd lose ground they couldn't afford to lose. He carried everything on the wooden tray carved with small flowers along its border. Beth had spent an entire afternoon once tracing those flowers with her fingertip while waiting for supper, naming each one, telling him what color they would be if the wood could be painted. He hadn't been able to bring himself to use a different tray. He wasn't sure he'd have been able to explain why to anyone who hadn't lost a child. The older sister took the bowl with trembling hands. She fed her sister first, coaxing her back to consciousness with small spoonfuls and soft words in Apache, syllables that Elijah couldn't translate but understood completely because he recognized the register, the tone that said, "I have you, I'm here, you have to stay, I cannot do this without you." The younger one's eyes opened, confused and frightened, and then the smell of food reached her, and something animal and ancient took over. She lunged for the bowl, trying to consume everything at once, trying to eat 5 days of starvation in 5 seconds. "Slow," Elijah said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has watched what happens when you don't. "Too fast and you'll vomit. Small bites. Trust me." The older sister translated, mixing Apache and Spanish and urgent gestures, and the younger one forced herself to slow down, tears streaming freely down her face. Something about receiving food without cruelty attached to it, without conditions or debt or violence waiting behind the kindness, had broken something open in her that starvation and thirst and exhaustion hadn't managed to break. Elijah looked away. He returned to his fire and busied himself stirring things that didn't need stirring and checking Dutch ovens that were exactly as he'd left them and adding wood to a fire that was already burning fine. He was good at looking busy. 5 years of solitude had made him expert at filling the visible surface of time with motion, while the interior stayed very still and very cold and carefully sealed. "Thank you," the older sister said eventually. Her voice was already stronger than it had been 20 minutes ago. "We would have died." "Maybe," Elijah said without turning around. "Why did you help us?" He was quiet for a moment. "Already told you. I'm Cookie." He fed them again at full dark, more beans and softened cornbread and a little salt pork he'd been saving for no occasion in particular. Because there were no occasions anymore, just days. They ate and thanked him and asked if they could help with dishes. The word no came out sharper than he meant it to, so he softened it. "Cookie's rules. Nobody touches the equipment. You want to help, you sit there and get strong. That's your job tonight." The older sister studied him with eyes that were already taking him apart in ways he wasn't sure he liked. "What's your name?" He hesitated. Names were connections. Connections were investments. Investments lost value when people left, and people always left, one way or another. Dead or gone, it came to the same thing in the end. You were alone again with nothing but the rules and the routine and the sourdough starter that had somehow outlasted everyone. "Cookie's second rule," he said finally. "A man who feeds you deserves your name in return." "Then tell me yours first." "Elijah. Elijah Mackenzie." "I'm Ayesha." She nodded toward her sister. "This is Kimama. We're of the Malero band. 3 days north, maybe 4 in our condition." Something moved across her face then. "We don't have a home anymore." He nodded, and didn't ask, because he understood that home was something that existed only in the past tense, and the people who'd lost it didn't need questions about it from strangers. They knew the shape of what was missing better than any words could outline. "Tonight," he said, turning back to the fire, "this is home enough. Sleep under the wagon. There are blankets in the back. We'll talk when you're stronger." They slept. He didn't. He sat by the fire and watched the perimeter and followed the rules, because the rules were the architecture of the life he'd built on the rubble of the one that had been destroyed, and without them he didn't know what he'd become. Something worse than alone, probably. Something that had stopped pretending. He told them about himself the next morning without entirely meaning to. It started because Ayesha mentioned that he talked in his sleep, had told someone named Beth that her biscuits were ready. His hands went still over the sourdough crock he'd been checking. The smell of it rose up, sour and clean and alive, and he stood there for a moment just breathing it. "My wife made this starter," he said. "My daughter helped feed it every morning. They've been dead 5 years. Starter's still alive. Funny how that works." Kimama asked quietly why he hadn't let it die with them. The question went in deeper than she'd probably intended. He kept his eyes on the crock, on the bubbling culture that smelled like Noah, like Beth, like mornings when his daughter would stick her small nose over the edge and announce with great seriousness whether the bread pet was happy or grumpy based on how many bubbles she could count. "It's the only thing they left me that's still breathing," he said finally. "Everything else is bones and memories and 4 tin plates I can't stop setting out. But this—" he touched the side of the crock carefully. "This is alive. Long as I keep it alive, they're not completely gone." He hadn't planned to tell them the rest, but words have their own momentum once you've been silent long enough, and he had been silent for a very long time. He mixed flour into the starter, and told them about the Thompson drive. 60 cowboys. 800 head. A trail boss decent enough to let Noah and Beth come along because Noah was useful and Thompson believed families shouldn't be separated when it could be helped. The water hole where they'd camped. The raiders who'd come for horses and been driven off. The man they'd shot dead. The poison poured into the barrel and revenged by men who were already gone before anyone understood what they'd done. He'd been gathering firewood. 50 yards away. Good dry mesquite for the morning fire, the kind of wood that held heat and made biscuits come out right. An hour. He'd been gone an hour. 7 people drank from that barrel. 5 survived. The young ones, the strong ones, the ones with more body to absorb the damage. Noah was small. Beth was 7 years old. The doctor had said afterward that if they'd gotten help faster, if someone had known sooner, if he'd been there instead of 50 yards away with an armful of wood, maybe the child could have been saved. "That's not your fault," Kimama said. "I was cookie," Elijah said. His voice was flat and final. "My job was keeping the food and water safe. That was the one job that actually mattered and I failed it." He put the biscuit rounds into the Dutch oven and set it in the coals. "After they died I couldn't stay with the drive. Couldn't look at that barrel. Couldn't cook for men who were alive when my family wasn't. Thompson gave me the wagon. Said take all the time I needed." He paused. That was 5 years ago. They were quiet with him for a while, which was the right thing to do, and he appreciated that they understood it without being told. He told them he wanted to teach them to make biscuits. Surprised himself saying it, but didn't take it back. Beth's recipe, Noah's starter, the thing they'd made together every morning of their life as a family. He told them what he needed in return. When they left, wherever they ended up going, they had to take some of the starter with them. Had to feed it every day. Had to make bread from it, and remember that it came from a woman named Noah who could make beans taste like love, and a little girl named Beth who believed bread was magic, and had named the starter her bread pet, and had checked on it every single morning the way other children checked on rabbits or puppies. Both sisters looked at him like he'd offered them something holy. "We promise," Kimama said. "We swear it." They learned to read his silences the way you learn to read weather, understanding when to speak and when to simply exist nearby and let the quiet be what it was. Ayesha started washing dishes, ignoring his objections with the practical authority of someone who had identified a need and was meeting it. Kimama began helping with food preparation, always just outside the boundary of Cookie's domain, respecting the rules while finding ways to be useful within them. And Elijah, despite every wall, despite every careful construction he'd assembled over 5 years of determined isolation, found himself adjusting to their presence the way a room adjusts to new furniture. The shape of things changed without the room itself changing. He started setting 3 plates instead of 4. He didn't entirely notice when it happened. The morning Kimama stood at the edge of the boundary and asked to learn to make biscuits, the morning she pressed up against the one rule that had never bent, was the morning Ayesha took him apart as carefully and precisely as she might field dress a rabbit. She didn't raise her voice. She just told him the truth, which was that he was keeping Noah and Beth frozen in time because moving forward felt like abandoning them, and that the sourdough was part of the shrine, and that letting other hands touch it would mean accepting that life was continuing to move whether he wanted it to or not. He wanted to argue. He couldn't, because she was right. He picked up the crock and held it carefully, the way you held something you understood might break. Noah used to say bread was meant to bring people together, he said. That keeping it to yourself defeated the whole purpose. He took a breath. She'd have been annoyed with me about the 4 plates. She always hated waste. He showed them everything. How to know if the starter was active, the bubbles and the smell and the way it rose, almost like breathing, if you watched it long enough. How to fold the dough gently so the biscuits came out tender rather than tough. How to cut them close together so they'd rise tall against each other in the Dutch oven. Kimama's hands shook the first time she touched the starter. She understood without being told what she was touching. Not just fermented flour and water. Years of daily faithfulness. The last living connection between a dead family and the man who kept refusing to let them be entirely gone. The biscuits came out perfect. Golden, risen, layered inside the way Noah's had always been. Elijah took a bite and closed his eyes. The taste hit him somewhere below the breastbone, butter and salt and that particular sour depth that wild yeast gave to things, and for a moment he was in his own kitchen again, Beth on her upturned bucket to reach the counter, Noah humming something without words while the morning light came in and the world was still whole. You did good, honey, he said to the empty air. These turned out just right. Kimama made a second batch, and those were even better, because understanding had started to settle into her hands, the specific intuition that came from paying real attention to how dough felt and behaved rather than just following steps. Elijah watched her work and felt something that he didn't have a clean name for, something that was equal parts grief and relief. He was passing something forward. Noah's knowledge moving through him into new hands, new kitchens, a future he wouldn't be part of. That was what she'd always intended starter to be for. Not a monument. A gift that kept moving. The warriors came on a Thursday, 2 riders appearing on the horizon in the late afternoon, riding with the purposeful directness of men delivering a message they hadn't composed themselves. Elijah's hand moved toward his rifle. Ayesha's hand moved to his arm. The conversation that followed was long and heated and conducted almost entirely in Apache, but Elijah caught enough from tone and posture and the particular quality of Kimama's stillness to understand the shape of it. The warrior promised to Ayesha had died in a hunting accident. Her father wanted them back. Not with an apology. Not with any acknowledgement that he'd been wrong to send them away. Just back, because the inconvenient circumstances that had made their leaving necessary had resolved themselves, and fathers expected daughters to come running when called. Ayesha's response made the lead warrior's jaw tighten. She and Kimama would return for harvest. 1 month. To fulfill their obligations as daughters of their people, because those obligations were real and they honored them. But they would return here afterward. And their father could take that offer or send his warriors home empty-handed and explain to the tribal council why he'd risked young men's lives for his pride. The warriors rode away with the faces of men who had expected a different conversation and weren't sure what to do with the one they'd had instead. "You're really going back?" Elijah said. "For a time," Kamama said. "To see if Father has changed. To make peace if we can. To be Apache even though we've chosen a different path. And if he hasn't changed, at least we'll know we tried." She paused. "Can we come back here? After harvest?" The question landed somewhere unexpected. He turned it over, examining what it asked him to agree to. Not just a return visit. An acknowledgement that this place meant something to them. That they were choosing it, choosing him, choosing the fire and the beans and the sourdough and the stubborn rules of a man who'd been cooking for ghosts. "It's not nowhere," Kamama said softly, reading something in his silence. "It's the first place we've felt safe in months. The first place someone fed us without wanting something back." He looked at the chuck wagon. The fire. The three crocs sitting together on the workspace. "Yeah," he heard himself say. "Yeah, you can come back. Anytime you want. Even though we're not family?" Kamama asked. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe you are," he said finally. "Maybe family isn't only blood. Maybe it's also who shows up when you're dying. Who learns your recipes. Who makes biscuits that taste like someone's favorite thing in the world." That night he did what Noah had always said you were supposed to do with Starter, what he'd bought 2 small ceramic crocs for years ago, and never managed to follow through on. He opened his crock and portioned out 2 generous scoops, one for each of them, 2 daughters of his Starter going out into the world to make their own bread and carry their own history, and remember where they came from. "Feed it every day," he told them. "Flour and water. Keep it warm. It'll last forever if you care for it." Both sisters held their crocks like they were cradling children. They left at dawn. He packed them enough supplies to get where they were going safely. Dried beans and cornbread and salt pork and a small pot, and everything Cookie knew about keeping people alive on the trail. He showed them how to test water and make coffee over open flame, and cook beans slow enough that they didn't burn. All the survival knowledge he'd spent 40 years accumulating, poured out now because they were going and he wanted them to arrive. As they shouldered their packs, Kamama turned back. "You saved us," she said. "Thank you for everything. For the food and the teaching and for letting us matter." "You saved me too," Elijah said. "Just took me a while to notice." He watched them until they disappeared over the ridge. Then he returned to his fire and sat for a while with his hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, listening to the desert, which offered nothing back as usual. He reached into the supply box and found Beth's plate, the small tin one with the chip in the rim where she dropped it once and cried about it for 10 minutes, and then forgotten about it entirely because she was 7 and tragedy had a short half-life at 7. He wrapped it carefully in cloth and set it inside the box. Not forgetting. Honoring. He kept 3 plates out on the table. 1 for him. 2 for the people who might come back. He stirred the sourdough and set it by the fire to stay warm. "Noah," he said to the desert wind that would carry his words nowhere in particular. "Beth. I split the starter today. Gave pieces to Ayesha and Kamama. Think you'd like them. Think you'd have loved them, actually." He paused. "I'm going to try something different. Going to stop cooking for ghosts. Going to cook for people who are alive. Who might come back. Who might stay." He listened to the silence, which was the same silence it had always been. doesn't mean I'm forgetting you. Just means I'm finally understanding what you tried to teach me. That food is meant to be shared. That starter survives by being given away. That love doesn't die when people do. It just changes shape. 6 months later, 2 figures appeared on the horizon at sunset. He saw them from a mile away, and his heart, which had learned to hold itself carefully, began to beat differently. They were carrying packs. Walking steadily. Each of them was carrying something small and wrapped in cloth, held with the particular careful attention you gave to things that were alive. Ayesha and Kimama came into camp grinning and set their packs down and opened their crocks without ceremony, letting the smell of active sourdough rise up into the evening air, sour and clean and alive. Fed it every single day, Ayesha said. Made bread for the whole tribe. Father said it was the best bread he'd ever eaten, though he died before admitting it came from a white man's recipe. Elijah felt his throat go tight. How long can you stay? As long as you'll have us, Ayesha said. Father gave us his blessing. Said we'd earned our freedom by going back, by helping with harvest, by proving we could be Apache and still choose our own path. She looked at Kimama. He said we'd found good people. That night they put all 3 starters together in one large bowl and stirred them gently until they became one culture, carrying 3 different histories in a single living thing. The bread they made from that combined starter was the best Elijah had ever eaten. Rich and complex, with layers of flavor that couldn't have existed without each component contributing something the others didn't have. They ate around the fire on tin plates with strong coffee and stars filling the sky overhead, and Kimama said through a mouthful of bread that this was the best she'd ever had, and Elijah said Beth would have agreed, and then softer, that Beth would have loved them both, would have dragged them into every bit of mischief she could find and made them promise to be her aunts. We would have loved her back, Ayesha said simply. A month after that, an old Apache man arrived on a painted horse with 2 nervous warriors riding behind him. He dismounted slowly and studied the chuck wagon and the fire, and the 3 people sitting around it with bread and coffee. He spoke at length to his daughters. The initial stiffness on both sides softened by degrees, walls coming down the way walls came down between people who had the same blood and couldn't quite stop loving each other no matter how much damage had been done in between. The father turned to Elijah. My daughters say you feed them, teach them, give them home when I send them away. I gave them food when they needed it, Elijah said. They gave me a reason to cook for someone besides ghosts. Fair trade. The man reached into his pack and produced a rolled hide revealing intricate beadwork, a ceremonial belt given to honor things that mattered. From my wife, he said. She say thank you? For keeping daughters alive. For being family when we were not. Elijah took the belt carefully. Tell your wife her daughters saved my life as much as I saved theirs. After the father rode away, Elijah asked what had been said at the end, the words that had made Kimama's eyes fill with tears. She told him. Her father had said they had found good path, and to walk it with honor. It was the closest he would ever come to admitting he'd been wrong, and it turned out to be enough. They made a feast that evening. Beans and cornbread and sourdough biscuits and roasted rabbit, and wild onions and coffee that could wake the dead, and they ate until there was nothing left to eat, and then sat together while the fire burned low and the desert went purple and then black around them. The chuck wagons sat in that desert crossroads for many more years. Long after Ayesha and Kimama brought their own families to visit. Long after children who called Elijah grandfather learned to make biscuits from starter that had fed 4 generations of hands. Long after the sourdough had been split, and carried to new homes and mixed back together and split again, growing stronger each time for having been shared. Elijah Mackenzie, cookie, widower, father, friend, finally understood what Noah had spent their whole life together trying to show him. The best way to keep someone alive wasn't to freeze them in time. It wasn't to guard their memory behind rules and routines and the ritual setting of plates for the dead. It was to take what they'd given you, the recipes and the love and the living culture of wild yeast and flour and water, and offer it forward to the next person who stumbled out of the desert with empty hands and an empty stomach and a heart that had forgotten what it felt like to be fed without cruelty attached. One bowl of beans at a time. One biscuit at a time. One family at a time. That was how you kept people alive. That was how love survived everything. Not by holding it still, but by letting it move.